Thank you very much. Actually, 20 years are taking me back to about the midpoint of my career on this. But I'm a lawyer. I've worked on public health policy issues from the beginning of the 1980s. I focused on issues like cigarette smoking because it was our leading cause of preventable death, and it seemed to be something really straightforward. We already knew by that time that people were smoking to get nicotine. They were dying because of the smoke. They were dying from a dirty delivery system. And it looked like we would be able to do with our leading cause of preventable death what has been done with previous leading causes of preventable death, like tuberculosis or smallpox. We could get rid of cigarettes fairly rapidly, just through pragmatic interventions on a range of things, but certainly dealing with the product itself. And the idea that we could prevent hundreds of millions of premature deaths by using intelligent, pragmatic policy, and that it would be like getting rid of smallpox. And the idea that getting rid of smallpox has probably saved over 500 million lives, and cigarette smoking's estimated it will cost about 1 billion lives this century. I also, while doing this, tried my best to understand what was going on as an academic exercise. And it helped to understand that even in dealing with eradication of smallpox, we ran into opposition to harm reduction measures like vaccinations. We ran into people who were supposed to be getting rid of smallpox who behaved in a moralistic fashion that denied the rights of the people whose lives were at risk, who faced riots from the people they were trying to vaccinate. And I think it's a lesson that runs through the history of public health of how do you go about doing these things properly? Why do we get into these sorts of problems? Why is it people who might have really good intentions end up doing things that actually create opposition from the very people whose lives they're trying to save? I mean, that's not public health. So I think in some ways what we run into is this interesting combination where, if we look at the advancement of the human race over the last couple hundred years, and I highly recommend Steven Pinker's recent book, Enlightenment Now, how life has got so dramatically better globally. And it has because we've used the principles of reason, science, humanism to solve problems. And it's why life expectancy is so much longer than what it used to be. It's why many diseases have been dealt with. It's why buildings tend not to fall down and burn down the way they used to. Airplanes are massively safer. Automobiles are far safer. We don't have 1 in 5 industrial workers dying in industrial accidents, dying or being injured every year on the job. We did back in the late 1800s. So we've got this great progress, but we also know from people like Kalestis Juma in his book Innovation and Its Enemies, and Thomas Kuhn in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that whenever you have new ideas, you'll have opposition. And often our opposition will be vicious. And it'll be for various reasons. Sometimes people have an economic interest in the status quo. Sometimes they have a personal, professional interest in the status quo. Sometimes they just don't like change. And in many ways, anytime you're trying to put forward new ideas, it's like you're running into these immovable objects of people who don't want to see change. But then we have work by people like Downes and Nunes in their book Big Bang Disruption, saying that new technology, innovation, is an unstoppable force. That governments can do things to try to, and the public can do things to try to limit access to new things. Nothing can slow innovation more than regulation, they say. No regulation can slow it more than food and drug regulation. No food and drug regulation can slow things as much as FDA regulation in the United States, but even FDA regulation in the United States can't stop it. So what we have is an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. And so what happens? And I think, as we are already hearing from Alex, when you have anything that has a moral overtone, the opposition becomes that much stronger. And I would actually disagree with some of what Alex said, because the moral overtones, get into so many things that now, looking back, we'd say, where'd that come from? There was strong moral opposition to bicycles. There was strong moral opposition to refrigeration. There's a really good example of a drug where if anybody was caught using it in Istanbul, they were subject to being flogged. If you're a repeat offender, you're subject to being sewn into a sack and thrown into the river. In Sweden, King Gustav III sentenced a condemned man to have to consume this drug every day until he died, as a punishment worse than hanging, because we knew this drug was deadly. Frederick the Great said that he didn't want anybody using that drug in Prussia. It was a threat to national security. There are fatwas issued against the drug. You'd go to hell if you used this drug. It was coffee. And we've had that sort of history on anything that comes along. The opposition can be extraordinary. And as much as we're slow on dealing with some of the issues of drug harm reduction now, very few people in Melbourne, my understanding, I'm from Canada and I'm a lawyer, but I don't really understand the laws of Australia, but I don't think anybody gets sewn into sacks and thrown into the river for what they're doing. So we've had these degrees of opposition, often vicious. It slows things down, often doesn't stop it. We've had disasters like alcohol prohibition. We've had catastrophes like the war on drugs. We have people wanting to keep going on that sort of approach on things like a war on nicotine. And that gets into issues of, well, where does that come from and what do we do about it? And I think that raises issues of ethics in the really fascinating area of moral psychology. In ethics, and I'll try to keep a lot of this fairly simple, there's this old statement called, "Thou shalt not lie." And that's a really good one to use when we talk about the ethics of public health, the ethics of public policy. There is no ethical basis for lying to the public. Even the idea of a noble lie, I will lie to you to try to get you to do something for your own good, can't be justified. And we're in an era where people can find out if they're being lied to. It isn't the sort of days where you could say, well, I'm Professor Sweanor and I have access to this big law library and I can access all of these books at the university, and so I know things you can't know and you have to believe me, I'm an expert. We laugh at people like that now because of the internet for getting and sharing information. And what's happening is people who take an ideological, a moralistic view, and they try to use the credentials they have to push that moralistic view, they get caught out. Because people can say, well, Sweanor said 10 things and every single one of them was wrong and I can prove it. And people write a blog and say, here's what he said, here are the links to show that it was nonsense. It destroys the credibility of experts. And that's a huge threat, not just to public health, that's a threat to democracy. That's a threat to the rule of law. And there's a lot of people now who benefit from destroying the credibility of experts. The idea that there are no experts, don't believe anybody, you need an autocrat to tell you what to do. And it's shocking that we have people in positions in scientific organizations, public health organizations, who are feeding that. They are saying things that are not justified on the basis of not being truthful, or at least it's being misleading. They are destroying their credibility. And, as is said in the history of dealing with issues of truthfulness, when a body says something that isn't true, it isn't that they get away with it because they have credibility. It's a big problem because they did have credibility, because they're destroying their credibility. And that gets into, why would people even do that? Why would you have health organizations saying things that are not true in order to try to fit some sort of pre-existing view of the world they have? And that gets us into issues of moral psychology. We have different operating principles, different ways we look at the world. And I'll simplify this into three areas: autonomy, community, and sanctity. That autonomy is about recognizing people's rights, their ability to have agency in their lives. Our goal is to give them the information, to empower them to make better decisions. That's really common in public health when it's done well. The community standard is much more of what do the authorities say? What did the Surgeon General say? What does the Pope say? What did the government say? We have to go with that. We have to go with what the authorities tell us to do. And sanctity is much more of a purity standard of you want to avoid doing something that's bad, that's impure, that's sinful, allows somebody to do something that you think is disgusting. And these all end up battling each other, and people having different views of this. It's like they're talking at cross purposes. They don't hear each other. So when we're dealing with things that have moral overtones, and almost everything seems to these days, moral overtones, it's culture wars, people reach conclusions very quickly on something that they see as moralistic. It's that immediate reaction, And then we use our frontal lobes to try to justify the position we've taken. So you can say, that's just wrong. Well, why is it wrong, David? Well, it's wrong because, and you try to think of a justification. So as long as you've got that moral psychology working, people are coming at this from different standpoints to say, well, if you are not giving people information that allows them to save their lives, those of us who have an autonomy standard get angry. Like, how could you do this? How could you not give people enough information to make an informed decision to save their lives? You've got people literally dying because of IV drug use or nicotine use or sexual behaviors, and you're not even giving them enough information that they can stay alive. That's anger from an autonomy standpoint. Those who take a community standard a view, an authority view, react with contempt. Who are you to question the view of the Surgeon General of the United States? That's contempt. And that's their worldview. There's an authority, you have to follow what the authority was saying. And those who have a sanctity view respond with disgust. And that's, so you mean to come into my child's school and talk to them about sex education? These pure children, these like innocent little girls being told, I think I'm going to throw up. That's the disgust view of people who see the world in that sort of purity standard. So what we've got is this, when we talk about, where did we get with the principles of the Enlightenment, of having reasoned discussion, of using science, of humanism, all the things that really advanced us. We can't even get the discussion when you've got people who see the world in such different ways. How do we get past that? How do we get to the point that if we're going to be moving forward, you want people to have enough information that they can make decisions? That whole autonomy standard. How do we get there in public health when other people are seeing the world in a different way? If they're responding with disgust or contempt, and we saw that with the people who are saying, how dare you even raise these issues? You shouldn't be able to come to Australia to talk about that. You shouldn't have a conference. That you are disagreeing with the position of, name of authority, World Health Organization, Anti-Cancer Council, whatever. Or what you're saying is disgusting. Somebody could be using a drug. And bodies should be pure. And I'm shocked that you would accept that somebody could be using a drug. You shouldn't be able to do that. You might encourage somebody else to use a drug. So the dynamic is so ingrained. It's part of who our species is. We react quickly with the amygdala, and then we use our frontal lobes to try to justify what we're doing. And usually in a battle between the amygdala and the frontal lobes, the amygdala wins. So we have to figure out, how do we get past this? And it's become more of a problem in recent years because of things like social media. Because misinformation can be shared so quickly. But something that starts as disinformation, so telling people that, for instance, vaping's killing lots and lots of people and addicting children, that can start as a disinformation campaign. But then it's picked up by other people on social media who send it to their friends. And you believe the stuff you get from your friends. You don't realize where that's generated. That's why content generated by, say, in Russia about the US election can be spread all over the US, and people believe it because they're getting it not from somebody in Russia, they're getting it from one of their friends who's picked it up from social media. So the disinformation just becomes misinformation that people are accepting because it's coming from people that they trust. So this whole idea of the problem of getting truthful information, of getting the principles of the Enlightenment becomes that much harder because we have social forces now that are really feeding misinformation. So, not wanting to leave on a completely down note, the question is, well, what can we do about this? And I think it's worth going back to what we heard right at the opening of the conference about things like racial laws and what they used to be. Because they changed. When I was born in Canada, there were still states in the United States that said it was illegal for anyone who was black to be in a relationship with anybody who was white. And black was defined as having even a single drop of black blood. I found out when I did 23andMe about a year ago, I've got black blood. I mean, I had an ancestor from the 1700s who's from West Africa. I didn't know that. 23andMe does. I have First Nations blood from Canada because I have French-Canadian ancestors, and there's lots of intermarriage. Well, you think, well, it's pretty hard to discriminate against people when you think, well, wait, I'm part of that. When my parents got married, and I'm going to be sneaking out to call my mom because it's her 96th birthday today, and yesterday was Dad's 98th birthday, but when they got married, it was a scandal because Dad was Catholic and Mom was Protestant, and you just didn't do that in the sort of town I was in. They had to elope, they had to run away. And we don't have that problem anymore. We have interracial relationships, and people don't question it. If a Protestant marries a Catholic, people say, like who cares? We had incredible discrimination against people on sexual orientation. In so many of our countries, including mine, that just ended. And it isn't like that old line of ideas don't change, it's just the people who have them eventually die. It's that people change their ideas. So the sorts of ideas I heard growing up about interracial relationships or different religions or different ethnic groups, they're just gone now. And what caused it? People talk to one another. They got personal stories. They say one of the things that changes the attitude of somebody who is completely, absolutely opposed to anybody being gay is having a favorite grandson say, "Grandpa, there's something I should tell you." And ideas can change like that. When somebody says, "I think anybody should just quit smoking, and they shouldn't use anything else," and then they meet somebody and they hear their story. When somebody says people shouldn't use IV drugs, and they go to a community meeting and somebody says, "I'm the person you're talking about. Let me tell you why I use these." It changes people's attitudes. So getting out information, those personal stories, can be incredibly important, and we've seen it. There's a great book called Progress, 10 Reasons to be Optimistic About the Future by Johan Norberg. And it details these things. We have gone through phenomenal changes. So if we look back, I think so much of what we do in public policy reminds me of, efforts in climbing mountains, where if you only look up, you feel you've got so far to go, you're never going to get there. You have to keep looking back and see how far you've come. So on a lot of issues, we have made phenomenal social progress. We're not burning witches anymore. That we are far more accepting on a whole range of things. We have made phenomenal progress. Life expectancy has increased so much. We've been able to just rationally deal with so many issues. We can do it again, we can do it on this one, and we can use some of the very same things that we've done to overcome those very obstacles that we have from things like moral psychology. Thank you.